5 years with New South Wales Health in a range of research, policy, service planning and management roles, mainly with the Hospitals and Health Services Policy and Planning Grant, and as a Director of Policy, Planning and Service Delivery for the New South Wales Pregnancy and Newborn Services Network. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Paccoa, for inviting me. I think it's a wonderful conference. I'm enjoying it enormously. It's wonderful content and it's also a wonderful organisation. I think it's really been a wonderful experience for me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the domestic abuse program overall, and then I'll start to focus specifically on how it was for the Indigenous men who were part of the samples that we used to do this evaluation. So a little overview of the magnitude of the issue. For all people serving community-based orders in New South Wales, 21% of them are usually DV offenders, so it's quite a large proportion of our caseload. And of all ATSI offenders, 23% of their convictions are related to domestic violence. We developed the DAP, the Domestic Abuse Program, in about 2006, and after piloting, and we made quite a few changes after that, we started rolling it out across the state. At the end of 2012, when I wrote the paper, we'd completed about 269 programs at 33 community corrections offices. There had been 3,338 participants enrolled, and nearly 500 facilitators had been trained. Andre Van Altina really takes most of the credit for doing the wonderful training of the facilitators. I did get some data from last financial year about how many people were enrolled, and there were 1,200 who were initially enrolled, so it was quite a big program, as you can appreciate. Also, most of our custodial centres also provide the domestic abuse program. So, what is the DAP? It's a 40-hour, 20-session closed group program. It has a psychoeducational basis. It's based on several theoretical evidence-based models and the What Works literature. So it's not just all Deleuze and it's not all CBT, it's actually an interweaving of the things that we have found in the literature that worked. It mainly uses CBT techniques and response needs, risk principles developed by Andrews and Bonta. The program primarily is supposed to target medium to high risk males as measured on our actuarial risk assessment instrument, the level of service inventory. In this study there were quite a few people who were low risk, low to medium risk, which was good because it gave us an opportunity to do comparisons with the effectiveness and how well it worked for the high risk people compared to the low risk. All the men in the program, in this study and in the program as well, they would either have had intimate partner violence, DV convictions, or in their case plan, domestic abuse issues, which their probation and parole officers at the time thought needed to be addressed. The program aims to change behaviours, attitudes and cognition for the men to learn new conflict resolution, prevention skills, better communication strategies, and to take charge of their own behaviour and be more accountable. We always have one male and a female facilitator, which we think is pretty important. It does prevent any collusion if there was only a male facilitator between the men and the facilitator. But more importantly, it allows, if there's a female facilitator there as well, she could model appropriate behaviours with the other facilitator, and she could always put in a female perspective. We think that's pretty important. And I shouldn't stress too much what we feel is the importance of having really, really well-trained facilitators, because they're the core of the success of the whole group process. They're the ones who are responsible for developing really good group dynamics, having empathy and develop a very strong therapeutic alliance with the offenders. Because if she can't really engage and she can't win or he or she can't win their trust, she's not going to be able to make the group cohesive and to be working constructively together. I might just tell you a little bit about facilitator training. All the facilitators do the group training programs or the group skills program. Group work facilitation program. That's 2 days, and they also do at the academy, I think, working with DV offenders, and they also do the training to actually deliver the program itself, and to use the materials and resources to make them competent in the delivery of the actual content of the program. Many of them used to, I don't know so much now, but they used to go on to do a creative skills advanced training that was over, one day every now and again over some months, and that's very special. It's really, I haven't done it. Has anyone done that? The creative specialist, yes, yeah, really specialised.
All up about a 7-day training.
Yeah, yes, it's quite intensive. Yeah, oh, thanks. Okay, what now? Just a little bit about the DAP. It contains 5 modules. The first one is identifying abuse, and I think in that module there's quite a bit of work done using the Duluth, as an example, the power and control wheel. One of the reasons we call it the domestic abuse program, because domestic violence is not just about physical violence, about psychological manipulations and isolating the woman, taking her away from friends and family. I had one client whose partner took her to Broken Hill from Sydney to make sure that she was so isolated and had no family or support, so he had total control over her. What other things? Taking their money, abusing her property, damaging her property, harming the animals. There are lots of other components to domestic abuse which are just not, violence. And my clients always say that, the psychological components and the mind games, telling them they're psycho or they're stupid or whatever, those things were much more difficult to manage than receiving a punch. And the second model is managing moods, beliefs, attitudes, and developing new communication strategies. Offence mapping, which is pretty important, so that the men get to understand the risk situations, the stress trigger points that are associated with them, having a terrible domestic incident. It could be Friday night when he's stayed at the pub too long and he's drunk too much alcohol and the dinner's ruined, and so they would develop strategies around that offence mapping process. And then sexual respect strategies and relationship skills also at the end. At the end of every module, the men are able to have time to talk about their own particular issues, things that are concerning them, things that are not going well for them. And that's a very important part of the whole process as well. So, we wanted to know whether the DAP worked, obviously. We firstly wanted to know that we weren't doing any harm. And if it wasn't working, we needed to know why it wasn't and what probably we needed to do to modify it or make it longer or, drop one component. So it was very important that we knew that it actually was effective. We did a preliminary evaluation when we only had about 100 men who had been through the program, and a control group, a matched control group, and a comparison group of men who had been through diverse little programs that had been delivered through the probation and parole officers throughout New South Wales that were non-standardised. They weren't manualised and they didn't adhere to any particular theoretical model. And that was a bit of a shock because we found that the men who'd gone to the random DV programs, they actually had more convictions than the control group. So we had actually made them worse. So it made us very, very concerned that if you're going to do programs, you've got to do it really, really well, otherwise you can do harm. The main aims of evaluating it were, did the DAP group of enrolled men, did they have a longer survival time to their first, violent reconviction or any reconviction, and did they have lower rates of reconvictions over the full follow-up period? We also want to know, what were the factors that predicted, survival time, and also, rates, so we could understand, who we needed to target most, or what aspects we needed to target most. We were thinking that, maybe, DAP completion might be an issue, their LSIR risk scores, their age or whatever. So we needed to identify all those issues. And we particularly want to know how many sessions were needed to get a therapeutic effect. The dosage and intensity, because it's no use delivering a program which is only 20 hours long and does absolutely nothing for anyone. If we needed to do one that was 60 hours long, well, that was important to know. And then, of course, we wanted to know whether it was cost effective. It might be all right for to deliver programs, but if it actually costs more than it costs for the person to have another reconviction or go to custody, well, there were no real benefits to the criminal justice system. So in the evaluation, there were 1,900 odd men, nice sturdy sample, of which the treatment group, the DAP enrollees, there were 1,953, and they'd been enrolled in 64 community-based DAP programs between October 2007 and June 30, 2010. And the unmatched, untreated control group we obviously had because, we didn't know whether, if there were some changes, whether they were better than or worse than the controls who received no interventions whatsoever. We matched a control, to each DAP enrollee as closely as we could, using 9 risk factors, so that, if we knew that we were controlling all the risk factors, that the controls and the DAP group were equivocal, exactly the same. If there was any differences, well, hopefully that could be, with validity, said it was due to them participating in the DAP program. We used a quasi-experimental research design. It would be lovely to do a random control model design, but you can't ethically really do that. You can't say, sorry, mate, you can't go to that when he really needed to go, was part of his order. So this is the best, the quasi-experimental research design is probably the next best. We used an intention to treat model so that anyone who was enrolled, they were included. Even if they didn't attend any sessions or even if they only attended 4 sessions, because we needed to be fair and valid. A lot of American DV programs have been evaluated and they've only used the data for the people who completed it, which is really, it really biases the results. So we adopted the intention to treat, which comes from medical model literature. in matching, I just thought a little bit how we matched them, the controls to a one by one to a DAP enrollee. They were matched on age, on Indigenous status, their risk level scores, the total score, and the 5 domain scores: AOD, education, criminal associates, employment history, accommodation. I can't remember what the other one is. Criminal convictions, the number of criminal convictions they'd had in the past 5 years, their employment, their times in custody, and the number of community-based orders that they had served in the past 5 years. And we looked at their most serious index conviction. We wanted them to match on that. We didn't want to match someone with a very low-key offence with someone who, had had a very serious assault. And we also matched them on type of order, whether it was a supervision or a parole or a breach order, and also the most serious conviction that they had ever committed. Now, measuring, very important part of the methodology. We obviously compared the two groups, the enrolled group, the DAP enrollees, and the untreated controls, using a Cox regression, which measures survival time to the first reconviction for both any sort of conviction and also for violent reconvictions. And that was measured from the index court date of the order that they were serving, or if they were parolees, from their parole release date. And to measure rates of reconvictions over time, we used Poisson regression, and a nice word, Poisson. Means fish, doesn't it? A Poisson regression to measure rates of reconvictions, which adjusts for the time at risk free in the community to reoffend during the follow-up period, because, two people might be 2 years since they started their order for both of them, but, one of those men may have been in custody for 14 months of that, so you obviously have to adjust for their exposure time, their at-risk time, to be valid. Oh, there's a pretty picture. The pretty pictures before I start talking about the data. It was really lovely. We were really surprised because we got an invitation to go to Canberra to receive a National Violent Crime Prevention Award. Oh wow. So we all trotted down there, and then a few weeks later we were asked to go down to Parliament House in Macquarie Street, Sydney, to get a Police Crime Prevention Award. So that's just to soften you up now that the results. We were pretty pleased that the DAP group, compared to the matched control group, significantly took longer to their first reconviction, both for any sort of crime and also for a violent crime, as measured with ASOC codes. And also they had lower rates of reconvictions over the follow-up period. And what we found was that before any therapeutic effect could be demonstrated, they actually had to complete the whole program. Those that dropped out and only did, 10 sessions or whatever, those who didn't start at all, there was absolutely no gain whatsoever. Their results were the same as the control, so they didn't benefit at all. They really had to do the whole complete program. The reason why we kept the non-starts in was because they all, I don't think I mentioned this, did I? They all have a assessment interview to assess their suitability for the program, and that includes making sure that they don't have a florid psychosis or a severe drug and alcohol dependency, or their intellectual cognitive facilities were so limited that they wouldn't be able to understand the concepts. But that assessment process is also a motivational interview to make them feel that this is really important for them to do it, and that the sequelae if they don't, if they're on a mandated court order to do a DV program, or they could be breached and go to jail. I better keep moving. Yeah, so it didn't work. It didn't work for the people, only did a small part of the program. And the cost savings, we were really pleased about. The cost savings for those 953 men compared to the controls was about 1.14 million, and that is 1,100 saved per DAP enrolment, and that gives a cost-benefit ratio of 2.89 for every dollar spent, which is really good. In the meta-analyses in the literature, that's a really quite respectable cost saving. So this is just to show you the survival analysis time to first reconviction. The curve, the DAP group, they're the blue curve at the top, and the control group are the green underneath them. Oops, what have I done? Going backwards. Oh, no, backwards, don't I? Time to first reconviction. It's very dodgy. So they all start up here. That's their index court date. That's the date of their conviction. And of course, none of them have reoffended. That's at 1. And then on the bottom are the days at risk. The cut-off was 1,000 days. And the numbers down the side, 0.7, that means that 70, so 30% had a reconviction at that point, the green point. When you take that down, I can't actually see, it's about 400 days. So that's a really clear, it's a nice visual way of seeing the survival analysis, and that model was significant. So at the 50% mark, 2 years and 7 months for the DAP enrollees for 50% of them to have had a reconviction, and from the controls, they reconvicted faster. It was 84 days faster, the median compared to the DAP enrollees. So it was about 10% faster, and that was significant. And, this is why, what I was getting to, was that, the next question was, was it effective for Indigenous men? We'd been wondering in offender programs branch whether we probably needed to develop a program specifically for Indigenous men with Indigenous content and, more specific to meet their needs. And also, Attorney General's Department had asked us to develop a program, but when we found out that the DAP was effective, we thought, well, first of all, we'll see if it actually worked for Indigenous men before we start doing anything. So we reanalysed the data specifically for Indigenous men, because we thought, well, if a DAP did work for them, maybe we didn't need to develop an entirely new program. Maybe we just needed to make some modifications and adaptations that are more specific to, their cultural needs. So, well, first of all, in the sample there were 360 Indigenous men, which was, quite a respectable number to do, a good analysis. 183 in the DAP group and 178 in the control group. And first we wanted to see, well, did they actually get to finish it? They didn't do quite as well as the non-Indigenous men. 58.5 Indigenous men completed compared to 63% of the non-Indigenous. So there was a difference there. The drop, and also more dropped out. There was the Indigenous men, 22% dropped out compared to 18% of the non-Indigenous. But those who didn't start was pretty much the same for Indigenous compared to non-Indigenous men. 20 for the Indigenous and 19 for the non-Indigenous not starting, which meant that there was a conservative bias in the data, because there was slightly more did not complete, and we know that was a protective factor. So, the big question, well, what about reconvictions? So when we compared the Indigenous men to the non-Indigenous, in terms of those who had a reconviction, 38% of Indigenous had a reconviction compared to 27% of the non-Indigenous. So it wasn't that wonderful. But when you look at the Indigenous men compared to their Indigenous controls, I mean, that was huge. 51% of the ATSI in the control group had a reconviction, compared to 38% of the non. So that's a really big difference, highly significant. And we also did binomial logistic regression because we wanted to see what were the predictors for the ATSI, the Indigenous men, to have a reconviction. And there were only 3 factors, and one was completing the DAP. That if they did that, their reconviction rates were lower, compares to the other data we'd collected when we looked at the whole sample. And the LSIR, alcohol and other drug score, a high score on that, more likely to have a reconviction, and also the number of previous convictions. So their past criminal history was a good predictor of future offending. But Indigenous status was not significant, so it wasn't being Indigenous was not a factor in determining whether you had a reconviction or not. And then we thought, well, we'll just look at those who completed. And that was wonderful because of the men who actually completed the whole program, 71% of the Indigenous men did not have any conviction, and compared to 74% of the non-Indigenous, which is, I don't think you could probably get better than that, really. We were very, very pleased. So the Indigenous men, if they complete the DAP, they do just as well as all the other men. This is just looking at the survival graph, comparing the Indigenous men to their own Indigenous controls, and it's a lovely survival curve. The DAP men are in the blue curve on the top, and the if I turn around to do that, I press a button, and the untreated control group at the bottom, and you can see there's a very clean difference there. So then we looked at the Indigenous men. Well, how did they compare to the non-Indigenous men? We looked at the Indigenous compared to their controls. Now we look at the Indigenous compared to the non-Indigenous, and that's pretty murky when you look at it. It's not actually a curve, is it? They start off the same. For about the first three months at the top up there. Oh gosh, where have I gone to? I don't think I'll use the red button anymore. It's too close to the others. 3 point, about 3. They were the same. The rates were the same for the Indigenous and not Indigenous in the first 3 months. But then, from 3 months to about 14 months, you can see that the green Indigenous men were actually doing better, and that was interesting. And we think that because it changed again at 14 months, but that would have been about the time when they were attending the DAP and being supervised as well. So they obviously seem to, from the survival data, they seem to respond very well to supervision and also attending the DAP program. But then it gets murky. The two curves merge again. So they were both, the Indigenous and the non-Indigenous were, the reconviction times were becoming equivalent again. But then right at the end, the Indigenous men tapered off much faster. So, it was a significant model, but the only factor that predicted all that was the LSIR criminal history, which was really interesting. Very interesting. Nothing else. But so they did quite well, I thought. We all thought. They did pretty well. And then we looked at the rates. What were the rates over time like? The Poisson model was significant, and there were only there were only two factors that were significantly associated with the rates, and one was not completing ADAPT, and also the total LSIR score. For every increase in the LSIR score, category score, the reconviction rate increased by 5%. So yes, I mean it's what you'd think intuitively, and also being Indigenous was not a predictor, nor was age. So that was really interesting. So the Indigenous men were not at greater risk, and they were really much the same as everyone else. Next question was, well, okay, but maybe it doesn't work for men living in rural areas who, may have much more traditional lifestyle, than Indigenous men living in metropolitan areas in Sydney mainly. So we looked at completion rates. We thought, well, the tyranny of distance might be a real factor. They can't get into the community corrections office from, out in the bush somewhere, wherever they were living. But the data was pretty good. 64%, completed the program in rural New South Wales compared to 57% in metropolitan Sydney. So they did better, more of them completed than their contemporaries in Sydney. And then when we looked at reconvictions after 1 year, 61% of Indigenous men in rural New South Wales had not had a conviction, compared to 73% in metropolitan areas with no conviction. So it wasn't quite as good. And non-ATSI, there was not much difference between their having a reconviction or not. 74% in rural and 72% in metropolitan. That wasn't. I mean, we were pleased that so many completed. Now, over the entire follow-up, comparing the rural to the metropolitan men, the Indigenous men, 68% had no reconviction, compared to 62% in rural New South Wales, and which was much better, of course, than their controls. Only 49% had no reconviction. And the non-Indigenous men, 71% in metropolitan areas, 73% in rural. There are a lot of different ethnicities and cultures represented. Would the results be better if they had their own program and their own Indigenous facilitator? And I presented this data at a Indigenous Justice Forum in Canberra a few years ago, and there was a very strong proportion of Indigenous people there in the audience, and they were adamant that the men really needed to do a healing program, developed by the Indigenous people or from each local area, because they all have different laws and rules, and they're quite different, and it should be developed by them and facilitated by elders, and that this would not work for them, even though we show them that it does actually work quite well for them. So anyway, what we have decided is that for the time being, the Indigenous men will be in the mainstream programs, and we found really that in just talking to people, and yes, Jana's mentioned it, and Wagga, I was in Wagga once, and there were Indigenous men coming out of a DAP program, and I said, how does this work for you? It would be better if there was some, culture-specific content, or, it was more relevant to your needs. And they said, no, look, we've got the same problems as them, we're all the same. They really do seem to prefer to, and also Matthew Willis from Australian Institute of Criminology, he did a lot of focus groups with Indigenous men, and he found the same sorts of things that the Indigenous men, they didn't want to be put into different programs. They didn't want to feel different. They didn't want to be made feel worse than or less than, and they actually seem to rise to the occasion when they're with other, non-Indigenous men in the groups. It was very important for them to feel included and the same as being treated the same as everyone else. That's not everyone, of course. 5 minutes? Okay. So that's it, I think. It's just the this was all done in-house. We did have some funding support from the Domestic Violence Intervention Court model people, Attorney Generals, when they were doing that program. And you can see the paper, Journal of Conflict Aggression. And the cost-benefit study has just been submitted to the Journal of Criminology. And the DAP evaluation of Indigenous men, the other authors are Matthew Willis from Australian Institute of Criminology and Kevin O'Sullivan and self. So, any questions?
Questions?
It's not really a question for you, it's just a comment. When you said you had the 64% for rural completion, that's probably because we used to take our community service van down to Narooma and we picked the guys up all along the coastline to Batemans Bay every time we ran the program to ensure that they had transport, because none of them had licences to get to the office.
So, Chris, the evaluation for the at-sea participants, that's not yet published, am I right? That's with the... yeah. So when are you expecting that might come out?
Well, they're pretty busy. And, I can put it into the format you need. And we'll do it. So, been sitting there for a while. It's an important paper, I think. It's really important because there's been this general perspective for a long while that, it's much better that they have programs that, that adjust themselves, and this data seems to suggest that that's not so. It's much better that, they're included, and they do. The universality of, poor relationships and interrelationship dynamics, and it's universal to all cultures. It's not just their culture or our culture or Middle East culture or whatever.
Is there any data on the difference between people doing in or outside of custody?
We haven't evaluated it in custody. Now this was only because it was being rolled out primarily in community corrections offices. We didn't know that. I would think that usually would be better than completion rates. We are saying now that people can't be enrolled in a program unless they have 3 months, at least, to enable them to.
Maybe better attendance rates.
Well, that is we thought would be. The results would be better.
Evaluation. Recidivism is often one measure about forgiveness. I was wondering whether there was any other follow-up with our partners and or ex-partners as to their experience of the men going through the program in terms of them starting to work, and there was all that coercive control. The physical violence, maybe again, the coercive control increases.
Yeah, well, I don't know. You're not New South Wales, are you? No. In New South Wales, there was a project called the Domestic Violence Court Intervention Model, and we were looking at different ways of managing the process, getting people to court better. It was interagency. We'd have meetings with police and the specialised court staff and the DV court liaison officer and manager of corrective community corrections. Who else was there? And that model was really great. I think, gently, you explaining you've got something similar happening in ACT. And one of the recommendations that came out of that was evaluated by Bureau of Crime Stats was that really the women have to be able to attend a program as well. It's not much use just treating the man, that she really needs to be in a program as well. I mean, the men were saying in the groups, oh, when I go home, I'll try all this new stuff and try to do this and say this, and she looks at me and says, what's the matter with you? What are you talking like that for? And so it was really important that they knew what the men were doing so that they could learn the same sorts of strategies, communication skills and whatever. But of course, corrective services has no mandate over these women. The man, if a man's enrolled in a DV program, they are supposed to be required, their supervising officer, to contact the partner and ask them to attend a community-based, not run by us, but by Relationships Australia and Centre Care. And also, they've been developed minimum standards for all these programs so that they have a sufficient quality that when the women attend them, they'll get the information and skills training that they need. Unfortunately, a lot of them say, no way. They don't even answer the door. But someone was telling me, wherever they were, that quite a few were going to, women partners of men in the DAP were going to external programs.
One more.
Oh.
In relation to that what we do, we've actually here in ACT is that we've in partnership with DVCS, which is Domestic Violence Crisis Support, and which is for the victim of the offence. And we, here in ACT, it is DVCS go. So if there was a 2 a.m. call out for police to a domestic violence situation, DVCS actually go with the police. So there are 24/7 staffing. So they actually know who the victim is from the get-go, and they are then on their books. And it's up to that person whether they engage in any ongoing support. So what we do, we have this connection with the partnership with DVCS, and we actually run a survey of the women. So what I was thinking, Chris, that we could actually share that data with you.
Yeah, that'd be wonderful.
At this stage, it's
a great initiative.
Fairly common that the current partner, basically says, oh, no, the other one was a little bit, she deserves all she got, it'll never happen to me. So not many of the women are actually taking up ongoing support during the time, but we also meet with DVCS, our facilitators, and the DVCS staff. We meet once every fortnight, face to face, and actually talk through all of the guys who are in the actual program, and we share that information, which is more around ensuring the safety of women and children.
Yeah, that's a wonderful model. Yeah, a real, international best practice, I would think.
So I think on behalf of Paccoa, I would like to thank you for coming, Chris, and just
Thank you, they're beautiful.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very